My name is Marianne Rankin. I'm the Senior Vice President and Provost here at the University of Maryland. And I get the pleasure and great honor of introducing these two very distinguished scholars to you and this wonderful conversation that I think we're all just going to be fascinated by. So this is a really special treat for me. I welcome you on behalf of the university and the president uh, to this terrific event. These are, as you all know, two authors whose work has given us new insights into our place in the world, uh, our uh, the critical cliffs that our country is about to fall off of, go over, whatever, just new insights into so many different issues and problems. And also the role that human relationships and community relationships play in creating and solving these problems. Um, I'll just introduce each of them separately and then sort of get out of the way. I think the program is going to be that uh, Michelle will speak for a while, 20 minutes or so, or 25 or 30 or 40. And then she and Tom will have a dialogue and then open the floor for questions. So, first, let me introduce our very distinguished guest, Tom Friedman, which he, of course, actually needs no introduction, but I have written this long thing, so you have to listen to it. So he has an incredibly distinguished career. He joined the London Bureau of United Press International after completing his master's degree and was dispatched a year later to Beirut, where he lived from 1979 to 1981 while covering the Lebanon Civil War. So talk about trial by fire. He was hired by the New York Times as a reporter in 1981 and redispatched to Beirut at the start of the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. His coverage of the war, particularly the Sabra and Shatila massacre, was recognized by his first Pulitzer Prize for international reporting, which he shared with Lauren Jenkins of the Washington Post. In June 1984, he was transferred to Jerusalem, where he served as the New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief until February 1988. In that year, he received his second Pulitzer Prize for international reporting, which cited his coverage of the first Palestinian Intifada. His book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, describing his experiences in the Middle East, won the 1989 U.S. National Book Award for nonfiction. He then covered Secretary of State James Baker during the administration of President George H.W. Bush. And following the election of Bill Clinton in 1982, he became the White House correspondent for the New York Times. In 1994, he began to write more about foreign policy and economics and moved to the op-ed page of the New York Times, and the following year as a foreign affairs columnist. In 2002, he won his third Pulitzer Prize for commentary for his clarity of vision based on extensive reporting and commenting on the worldwide impact of the terrorism threat. In February 2002, Tom met with Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah and encouraged him to make a comprehensive attempt to end the Arab-Israeli conflict by normalizing Arab relations with Israel in exchange for return of refugees, cessation of the Israel territorial occupations. Abdullah proposed the Arab Peace Initiative at the Beirut Summit that March, which Friedman has since strongly supported. In 2004, Tom received the Overseas Press Club Award for Lifetime Achievement and was named to the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. Additionally, I'm sorry, I still have more. Additionally, in 2000, sorry, Michelle, you're not going to have any time. You invited the wrong person to. Yeah, okay, all right. All right, I just want to say one other thing because it had a big impact on my life, and that was his book on The World is Flat, A Brief History of the 21st Century, changed my life, and I think it certainly changed a lot of people's perspective about the place of the U.S. in the world and the need for much more emphasis here on STEM education and technology development and so on. But he's published many, many other very influential books and articles. Michelle, as you also know, I'm sure, is one of our most distinguished faculty. In fact, she is named a distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland. She uses field experimental, computational, and neuroscience methods to understand the evolution of culture and its multi-level consequences for human groups. Her work has been featured in lots of different places: the Washington Post, New York Times, Boston Globe, NPR, Voice of America. I could go on and on. She is originally from New York and earned her BA in psychology from Colgate in 1989, received her master's and PhD in social and organizational psychology from the University of Illinois, and joined UMD shortly thereafter as a fresh PhD in 1996 as an assistant professor. She rose quickly through the ranks here as associate, then full professor, and she was named a Distinguished University Scholar Teacher in 2009, and in 2017, a Distinguished University Professor, our highest rank. This is just a guess, but because I haven't checked birth records or anything, but I think she is probably the youngest of our 90 or so DUPs here at the university. Is that true? One more younger? Oh, I'm surprised. Well, she's definitely the best looking and most energetic. I don't actually know who that other person is, so that's anyway. She has published in lots of different scientific outlets like Science, PNAS, Proceedings of the Royal Academy, Annual Review of Psychology, Journal of Applied Psychology. I could, again, go on and on. She's received over $13 million in research funds from various agencies. She's the author of several books, including the one we're discussing today, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World. She's co-editor of a number of, and has started annual series as well. She has been the past president of the International Association for Conflict Management, division chair of the Conflict Division of the Academy of Management, and past treasurer of the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology. She received the 2017 Outstanding International Psychologist Award from the American Psychological Association, the 2016 Diner Award from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and the Annalise Research Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She was elected to the board at the National Academy of Sciences in 2018. So please join me in welcoming these two very distinguished authors for a discussion of Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire Our World. Michelle?
So I want to thank all of you for coming, family, friends, colleagues, and my friend Tom Friedman. We were introduced by Shibli Talhami, and we started having breakfast together, and it was like intellectual firecrackers. We both broke out our computers and we're just frantically writing things down, like taking each other's ideas and kind of melding them together. And then when I told Tom I was publishing this book, he said, "Oh, would you like to do a book talk together?" I'm like, "Oh, sure, that sounds great. Now, what does that mean? What do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, we'll just talk like we do at breakfast." So I really thank you for coming out here. I'm going to give a 20, 25-minute max talk. I have my clock here to make sure that's the case, and my lab manager, Emmy, there to keep me in line. Just to give you a sense of what this book is about and where it came from. And then we're going to have a chat, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we'll have some wine and some appetizers. So for about 3 decades, I've been studying a really kind of a fascinating puzzle. It's something that's omnipresent, it's all around us, but it's invisible. We always take it for granted, often take it for granted. It's something that is distinctly human. We invented it. No other species has it to the same extent as we do. It's also something that produces quite a bit of conflict, but also an immense amount of cooperation. And this puzzle is something that we call culture. And culture is this very powerful force that is affecting us every day from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. It affects everything from our politics to our parenting, from our nations to our neurons. But strangely enough, we know very little about it. We humans have accomplished great technological feats. We've put a man on the moon. We've wired the earth. We've eradicated diseases. And we've even trained dogs to ride skateboards. Not my dog. But we still know very little about our own differences. That's a little too close to home. And over the last actually 30 years, since about 1988, I've been trying to study cultures to understand, is there deep cultural codes that help us understand ourselves, essentially. And so I've been studying cultures from the Aztecs to Alabama, from Sparta to Singapore, from the Silicon Valley to the military. And I'll talk about some of that research. I want to say that I wasn't always so enlightened to think about culture. I was born in New York, and I had a very typical New Yorker view of the world, as the New Yorker cartoon shows. You could see that there's Manhattan, there's Jersey. We actually recognize New Jersey. And then there's kind of the rest of the world out there, right? And that view of the world was very comforting to me until I took a semester abroad trip over to London. And I remember, this was in 1988, in January, and I remember being really surprised at how much culture shock I was having. And I called my father, who's right here in the audience, and I said, Dad, you know, it's really strange being here. It's so different. It's also strange people going from London to Paris or London to the Netherlands just for the weekend. And he said, almost instantaneously, I'll never forget this phone call because it changed my life. He said one phrase. He said, well, it's like going from New York, he's from Brooklyn, to Pennsylvania. Just think about it like that. And I thought, wow, what an awesome metaphor. And literally the next day, this is a true story, I booked a trip to Egypt on a low-budget Felucca tour, because we had a lot of time on our hands on this semester abroad trip. And I called him up. He was kind of freaking out. I was like, Dad, it's like going from New York to California. Don't worry about it. And that's really where I started discovering how little I knew about culture and how powerful of a force it was. But it was all around us and invisible. It's like the famous adage of two fish swimming in water. And another fish comes up to them and says, how's the water, guys? And they say, what the hell is water? It's something that is really, it reflects that a lot of times our most important realities are things that we can't see. So I left London, came back to Colgate. I switched from pre-med, my sort of dream to become a medical doctor, to become a cross-cultural psychologist. I convinced my younger brother to become the doctor of the family. And I went to Champaign-Urbana, the Twin Cities. They're not so lovely of a place, but it was a great place to go to work with Harry Trandis, who was the founder of our field. And there, I really started using the tools of science to understand human difference. And I started going around the world and looking at lots of different distinctions that were really kind of puzzling. So for example, you can go to Singapore, where there's a strong fine, or a large fine for chewing gum, or even for flying kites, and many other things, like littering or singing loudly. It's called the fine country because of that, because there's a lot of fines. You could take a short trip over to New Zealand and see people walking barefoot in banks. This is true. A reporter called me and asked me to describe why people are doing this, not wearing shoes all over the place. You see in university settings pretty frequent couch burnings. We're not going to do that here, I promise. New Zealand's also the only nation I know that has its own self-declared wizard. So this is a guy that came from the UK, and he set up shop in the city streets of New Zealand. He was debating everything from rugby to religion. And instead of punishing the deviant, the prime minister gave him a license to be the wizard of the country, and his job was to entertain people and keep them happy. And he's known to put large nests on top of libraries and perch himself from eggs and things like that. This is a true story. You can also go over to Germany, for example, other contrasts that I've seen, and see people waiting very patiently on the street corner, even if there's no cars around. And then you can go to my hometown, New York City, and see people jaywalking, even with kids in tow. This is a very interesting device right here. This is outside of Cologne, and this is a true story. This is actually a ping pong game that this guy is playing with the person across the street from him. And if you look at what it's doing, it's telling you when the light is about to change, so that you are behaving and having fun at the same time and waiting for the light to change. On a more serious note, you could see the case where, in the Netherlands, you can have you can have smoke weed publicly, whereas the same behavior can get you the death penalty in other cultures. There's other puzzling trends around the world, like the fact that we're giving, at least in the US, our kids more strange names, more unique names over time. I have a friend, Michael Morris, who was in a grocery store in Manhattan where he asked for the candy where it was, and they said she doesn't work here anymore, just as an indication. But also, we see other trends of like people are becoming more obese in this country, fatter and fatter. Is there anything about these kinds of distinctions that is really unites these distinctions? And I would suggest that yes, there is. And this is what I've been studying. This is the subject of the book. And all of these examples are examples of differences in social norms around the world. And our ability as humans is really remarkable to develop and enforce social norms. As early as 3 years old, you can see that kids are even abiding by social norms and enforcing them. And they're very important in terms of coordinating and predicting our own behavior. So for example, we take it for granted from when we go outside that we don't all drive on the right and left side of the street at the same time. We don't expect that trains and airplanes are going to be late all the time. Well, maybe New Jersey Transit and Amtrak are. But we take it for granted that restaurants will be open when they're scheduled to be open and that people won't steal food from each other's plates. I kind of suggested I was going to do that at breakfast with Tom just to get his reaction. Or that people aren't facing the back of the elevators or pushing all the buttons. We are constantly following social norms. We're an ultra-normative species to that extent. And it's the glue that binds us together. But what I've seen in my research is that this glue is stronger in some contexts than others. And this is what I call tight cultures versus loose cultures. Tight cultures have very strong norms and punishments when people deviate from the rules. They're rule makers. Loose cultures are much more permissive, have weaker norms. They're rule breakers. And I started to really examine this distinction first with surveys and then with observations, then ethnographies. And I'm going to just describe some of the findings that we have about this distinction. In this first examination, this was at the most macro level of the level of nations. And I went out to many different countries, surveying people and observing behavior in city streets, and gathering data on their histories and their ecologies. And we could easily see in this study that we can differentiate with scientific tools how tight or loose our countries in general. It's important to say that all cultures have tight and loose domains, but we can, just like as personality dimensions, classify introverts and extroverts on a continuum. We can do the same thing with nations. And in our research, we showed that places like Japan and Singapore, Germany, Austria, they tend to veer tight. And cultures like Brazil and New Zealand, Greece, the Netherlands, they tend to veer loose. And what I found was some really interesting advantages and disadvantages of these two cultural templates, depending on your vantage point. So for example, and you'll see this not just at the national level, but later we'll see it at the state level and even at the level of social class. So there tends to be a sort of what physics call a fractal pattern of this dimension, even though that tends to have statistical types of properties for any physicists in the audience. I know I'm not supposed to use that metaphor, but it is really interesting to see how this lens can help us understand different levels of reality around us. So what I found was that tight cultures across the board have much less crime. They're much more orderly. They have much more monitoring, more police per capita, more security people that are roaming the streets. And actually, there's a really interesting Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me episode where we were asked, what do Japanese police officers need more of? Do they need more pay, more vacation? Turns out that they need more crime because they have such low crime that they actually have been found to actually try to egg people on to actually commit crimes. So it's a very safe place, very orderly. Tight cultures in our data also have more uniformity and synchrony. They have people who are wearing more similar clothing. They have people who are driving more similar cars. This is actual data where we were actually observing the make and color of cars. In one of our most interesting tidbits about tightness, we could see that the clocks in city streets in tight cultures were more accurate. They had more of the same time. Whereas in loose cultures, like in Brazil or in Greece, you weren't quite sure what time it was. The clocks really deviated by almost even 2 to 3 minutes. And so this synchrony is something that is very important. Also, we could see that there's much more self-control in tight cultures. In contexts where there's a lot of social control and monitoring, that parallels in terms of your individual self-control. And we found that tight cultures tend to have lower alcoholism, lower drug abuse and debt, and even less obesity, even controlling for height and things like that. So you can think about the flip side of this is that loose cultures tend to actually be pretty disorderly. They have more crime, they're less synchronous, and they have a real host of self-regulation failures. Actually, I even found that in loose cultures, pets that we have tend to be more fat. So my colleague Jens and I, who's from Germany originally, used to debate that we should actually be studying tight loose and dogs and cats around the world. Turns out that 50% of our dogs are overweight, as 60% of our cats are overweight. And just as an example of this is my dog, Pepper, and she is definitely overweight, as a lot of you have pointed out. She would beg to differ, but she begs for food, which is why she's so fat. So, tight cultures have the market on order. Loose cultures, by contrast, they have the market on openness. So you could see now some of the trade-offs that are involved in this distinction. Loose cultures are more open to different types of people, including immigrants, in terms of people who are stigmatized in all sorts of ways. In another experiment, we had people going around the world wearing warts that I bought them, or wearing tattoos and nose rings. And the simple question was to ask for help on city streets or for help in malls. And they were all standardized. And it was very clear that when people were just wearing their regular face, whatever that means, they were helped the same in tight and loose cultures. But when they were looking different, they were helped much less in tight cultures. And in loose cultures, they were much more open to people who were stigmatized. Loose cultures are also much more creative. They have more ideas. They enter creative contests more and they win them more. And they're also more open to change. And I think this is something that Tom and I will talk about. In our computer models, when we try to look at change with artificial societies, we could see that when we enter a new norm into the population that even has better value for the population, it takes much longer for this norm to spread throughout a tight population than a loose one. So the point here is that there's a lot of trade-offs with tight and loose that we can see. Also, I was curious to see, why does this distinction evolve in the first place? They don't seem to have any logic in terms of their location, religion, language. But what we did find was that tight cultures tend to have a lot more threat, either from Mother Nature or human nature. So, for example, some countries in the world have a lot of Mother Nature's fury, a lot of natural disasters all the time for centuries, a lot of invasions they have to worry about, a lot of people around, high population density, or a lot of pathogens. And all these things, when you think about it, they're contexts where we want strong rules. We want to be able to coordinate in these contexts to survive. So there's a real hidden logic around tight and loose cultures, and we showed that with a lot of data in this study. We looked at population densities far back as 1500. We looked at how many times countries were invaded over the last 100 years. I remember my daughter Hannah asking me years ago, are we worried about Mexico and Canada invading us? Now, some people might worry about that now. We're not going to talk about them. Maybe later we will. But the point here is that as a nation, we've been separated by two oceans. We've had a relatively, with some exceptions by state, safe existence. There, of course, are other factors that predict tight and loose. Not all tight cultures have been threatened. Not all loose cultures have been on, have not had harm or been in harm's way. But it is a general relationship that we can see. We know also that religiosity pushes groups toward tightness. We know that debate and diversity pushes groups toward looseness. This might be why, for example, Israel in our data, despite its threat, is exceptionally loose with some different pockets that we can find of tightness. And that's because of the adage of having 3 Jews in the room gives you like 10 opinions, right? I could say that's true from my experience. Again, back to my daughter, when she was bat mitzvahed, she was actually reading her Torah portion and she was disagreeing with it in her speech to me. And I said to her, sweetie, what are you doing? Why are you disagreeing with your speech? And she said, well, the rabbi told me to. So I think that's a good example of how debate helps you to, or pushes us towards looseness. We've found this pattern not just in modern nations. We like to think we're kind of special as humans, especially in my discipline, psychology. But if you look back, we could see the same pattern. We've coded hundreds of ethnographies. I partnered with anthropologists, archaeologists. We could see and rate countries in those ethnographies for their level of tight loose. They have very similar types of risk factors in terms of threat causing the evolution of tightness. This is, as I said, it's kind of a fractal pattern. We can see it occurring across different levels of analysis. I've studied the US 50 states. And we could see that a different map that's a little more graduated than just red versus blue, where the South tends to veer tight, some Midwestern states veer tight, the coast tend to veer loose. Of course, you can also zoom into a state and find some tight and loose communities, but it follows a very similar pattern. We can see that tight states tend to have more natural disasters, They have more pathogen prevalence. They have more food insecurity. They also are more rural, and rurality, if that's a word, actually allows more monitoring. And when people are monitored more, they are more norm abidant. So this is following a similar kind of logic. Also, we see the tight-loose trade-off at the state level. Tight states have people who are what psychologists call conscientious, more of them. They have more order in terms of law enforcement, more stability in terms of their homes and homelessness, less of it. And they have more self-control in terms of drugs and alcohol and debt, with the exception of opioids, which we can touch on. They're also more polite states. I actually analyzed this because there's polls of how polite the states are, and New York is #1 on rudeness, which explains why when I flip someone off in the South, I got in some really serious trouble. So I would not recommend that. Loose states are comparatively more disorganized, just like at the national level, but they tend to be more open. And they have people who have higher openness, more creativity, patents per capita. They have more equality in terms of actual numbers of discrimination claims and so forth. They also tend to be more fun. So they're less polite, but they're more fun. So I want to just mention a couple other things before getting to dynamics and then getting into our chat. I've been looking more recently at the culture of social class, because often we think about class as just being about our bank accounts. But actually, the same logic, we can start thinking about the working versus the upper class as really varying on the tight-loose spectrum. And we started looking at this with surveys. We did see that the working class, typically who have just a high school education or less, tend to report that their households and their occupations are much, much tighter. They also report they want tighter rules. When we ask them even to just report, give us 5 words that you think about when you hear the word rules, they tend to come up with positive associations like structure, good. It's the upper class that thinks that they're kind of goody two-shoes or they're a nuisance. We also have seen some studies out of UC Berkeley where they hid in bushes and looked at who's violating traffic rules. Is it the Jaguars or is it the plumber vans? Turns out that Jaguars are way more likely to violate rules and even cut off pedestrians, which is illegal in California, maybe not in New York. And so you see this kind of rule breaking more in the upper class. You also see that they're rule breaking in conversations, in terms of conversation etiquette. Upper class reports engaging in more unethical behavior than the working class. But on the flip side, again, in our studies, they tend to be more open. They're more creative, and they also are more open to people who are different as compared to the working class. Not surprisingly, that same threat angle is something that helps us understand that variation. In our research, we could see that the working class is very concerned about falling into poverty or hard living that sociologists talk about. They occupy more dangerous occupations where they can be subject to death and injury. In our data, we actually got their zip codes, and we traced back with census data the kind of neighborhoods that the working class and upper class were living in. They were far more dangerous. And of course, today, in this bewildering moment, we know that the working class is being severely threatened by a lot of disruptions. And they're yearning for that tight order that some people are promising them. Some leaders are promising them all around the world, not just here. I want to just mention one study that we did where we went to see how far does this difference, when does this really start emerging? And we thought, well, at age 3, kids start thinking about norms. So we actually studied how they reacted to, in this case, a puppet that was either violating rules or was abiding by the rules. And this is the case where we brought in working class kids and middle class kids, and they were playing with this puppet, and Max the puppet suddenly became Max the norm violator. He starts violating the rules of the game and announcing he's playing it correctly. And we simply coded the reactions, and we could see very clearly it was the working class kids that were far more disturbed by this than the middle class kids. So that's just a couple of different levels of analysis. I could talk about organizations, but we got to move on to our conversation. I want to say a couple other things about the fact that we can try to use this lens to understand the world today. This is a construct that is very dynamic. It can change, and we've seen that. After the Boston bombing, we went out and surveyed people in the United States, in Boston, and we could clearly see that people who felt most threatened by this event desired more tightness, and they started to be leaning toward a tight mindset, becoming more ethnocentric and seeing their worlds as more superior than others. Even in our own very lab, we can manipulate threat very easily in a matter of a couple of minutes, whether it's about population density on campus, terrorism threats on campus, natural disasters. And we see that very quickly, we can see that threats don't need to be real even to tighten people up. Now, this is temporary tightening, I'd call it, but clearly in these studies, whatever threat they're about, we see that people want stronger rules in these contexts. They want greater punishments for the same violations than when people are not threatened. And they also have preference for autocratic leaders who can provide that kind of order and structure in those threatening environments. Obviously, I'm going to have to say something about our leaders, because what we see in our data is that people who did feel the most threatened wanted greater tightness, and this in turn was predicting their vote for Trump. This was not just unique to the United States, it was also something we can see with Le Pen and data in France before that election. And clearly we have, in some ways we see leaders know this psychology, right? This is not just some personalities that are taking over in this particular time. This is a classic evolutionary type principle that leaders will tend to exaggerate, activate, and target people who are threatened already in order to be elected. And now we're actually been analyzing, we're developing a threat dictionary to really show this empirically around the world, what's happening as leaders are using this typology. So I want to end by saying, which is better, tight or loose? For centuries, philosophers have been talking about, do we have freedom or should we have constraint? Now, they never collect any data, they're philosophers. Sorry for the people in the audience that are philosophers. But look at how people like Plato or Confucius or Hobbes, they thought, we really need rules because humans are kind of lousy people and we need order. And then you look at other people, John Stuart Mill, even Freud, who felt rules are problematic. They call all sorts of neuroses, according to Freud, in his Civilizations book, and discontents. So the question is, which is better? And we sort of posited maybe neither are better. Maybe too tight or too loose, too much freedom, too much constraint is problematic for humans. And that we really have been asking the wrong questions. And so this is what we call the Goldilocks principle of the strength of norms. And the idea would be that if you get really too loose, life becomes really unpredictable. It becomes kind of what I was describing earlier, where you really cannot understand and coordinate other human beings. If we get too tight, then we feel like we want to escape because it's too much repression. And this is exactly what we found in our research. We found that both extremely tight and extremely loose cultures, this is national level, have higher depression, extremely tight and loose have higher suicide. This is something Durkheim actually would have predicted, blood pressure, and lower happiness. So this is an important principle, I think, as we start analyzing what's happening around the world. When we start veering too loose, when we have cultural vacuums, when things get normalist, that's when tight forces take over. And I talk about, toward the end of the book, some of the foreign policy implications for having tight-loose balance. That we should be able to, at this point in time, and I think Tom will speak to this, be able to anticipate these pendulum shifts and cultural vacuums that invite these tight forces, whether they're autocrats or extremists. We've seen this, and I go through examples in the book, in Egypt. We see this in ISIS. We see this with the appeal of Duterte, who's providing order in a context where people felt great instability, and as well as in Libya. The main thing I want to end on is just to say that I think that we invented culture, we invented norms, we can use them to better our planet. We need to start being mindful about it because we've been thinking about it as it's affecting us versus us using it. And I talk a lot about a principle that we should really start looking for contexts that are really where we need to tighten loose norms, where things have gotten too much freedom. The great example is the wild west of the internet. What Tom recently talked about is the second inning. The first inning was great of the internet, provided all these great things, but guess what? It's a total normalist place. And that psychologists would have predicted that. There's very little monitoring, very little accountability. And it's time for us to tighten up that context. Americans tend to be a little nervous about getting tighter. We don't want to go in the extreme opposite direction, like we'll see in places like China, but we do need to tighten up. Also, we can think about places that we want to loosen tight norms. There are plenty of places in the world where very tight gender norms and strong norms for large families are colliding with Mother Nature in terms of overpopulation. So I can talk more about the Goldilocks principle, not just as it applies to foreign policy, but also as it applies to parenting and to our workplaces. Places like, for example, Tesla arguably need to tighten up. Places like United last year, we saw they need to loosen up, introduce some discretion into that system. So I think it's a principle we can use for the betterment of our planet. And I will end there so that we can have our chat. And thank you so much for listening.
quite a wrenching national drama right now around the selection of our next Supreme Court justice. All of us are aware of what's going on. How does tight loose your analytical framework? How can it be used to uh, better understand? I'm not here to take sides one way or another, but what happened here? Because obviously the culture of Bethesda 30 years ago was one thing. It's being judged in a different context today. Um, we're going through a lot of normative changes, around Me Too. We have a president who's very loose in some ways.
Say the least.
Say the least, exactly. Um, so if I were interviewing you at the University of Maryland and asking you for your help in writing my next column through the lens you're providing, how do these themes show up, basically, in this drama that we're all witnessing, and how would it maybe better enable us to understand?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think in the book I talk a lot about how tight loose is also relevant to power. So people in high power positions tend to live in looser worlds. Like they get away with a lot more deviant behavior. People who are in lower status positions, that includes women, minorities, other identities, they live in tighter worlds. And actually, we've shown this empirically. So in some studies, we've actually given managers some studies about, or some scenarios of Letitia or Brad or Jamal or Lauren performing some deviant behaviors and just seeing like how severe do you rate these things. And it's remarkable to see not only do the lower status people get judged more harshly, but also the high power people let other high power people off the hook. And that's something we've seen time and time again. And what's interesting is this is not tribalism. It's not as though the low power people were protecting the other low power people. It really is a distinct interaction of high power people letting high power people off the hook. And this is a matter of accountability. I think this moment that we see in this world of including our leaders who are norm violators, the quintessential norm violators, you have to ask yourself, how do they get away with this?
Just apropos of that, I was thinking of a column the other day. I watched the president's, and we're not going to make this assumption, but it's on my mind. So, the speech he gave in, I guess, Mississippi, where he mocked, Ford, and there were all these people behind him laughing, and I wanted to do a column on laughing, like why were these people laughing? In a very serious way.
Yeah.
What exactly were they laughing about? Because he was being very loose. They probably live in very tight contexts. What was going on?
Yeah, it's interesting that these norm violations become contagious.
Right. Yeah.
And we've seen this. Actually, there's some studies, I hate to say, going back to research, but my psychology colleagues are here. In the Netherlands, they'll show that people, when they're in contexts where people are told don't engage in graffiti, but people doing it anyway, they'll start violating other norms. They start littering, for example, or doing other things. It's like a norm violation contagion. And that's what's happening in this context, is that he's giving license to people to violate norms. And what's the problem here is all about accountability, right? Because when you are monitored and you're accountable for good behavior, you don't do these kinds of things. And the problem, and I don't want to get too political, but it is the case that he's not being held to any standards of accountability by his own party. When you see people doing that, it gives them even more license to do that. It's happening around the world. I've read your columns where, it used to be that in Egypt or in Turkey, they felt accountable because our presidents would keep them accountable. And now they're also misbehaving in all sorts of ways and squelching dissent.
People are cheating in a lot of places. Erdogan is cheating in Turkey openly. Sisi is cheating in Egypt. MBS in Saudi Arabia of late. It does feel like the cat's away. And you could even say Xi Jinping by making himself leader for life.
Yeah.
Would he have done that with a strong American? Probably no relationship exactly, but it does feel like when people in America are cheating, it becomes a license.
Yeah, that's right. It's a contagion of norm violation. I think what you write about in your columns is really hits the nail on the head in that when people can ship at their jobs, their $175,000 salary and their parking spot at Reagan, they're not going to call out this negative behavior. We need these brave people who are calling him out. And you're starting to see that. And I think my hope, and I'm optimistic, is that this is going to start to happen more in a ground-up fashion. The other issue here is that he's capitalizing on threat. He's been targeting people who are threatened. And actually, we've missed the boat on this situation.
Talk about that.
I think that the United States is very loose, unlike other countries like Germany, for example, that has a safety net for the working class, that has standardized procedures to get people certificates in order to change jobs easily. We let people kind of do their own thing. We missed the boat in the election by not understanding the real threat that these populations are experiencing.
It was too loose for some people.
Yeah.
They were living in a context that was just too loose. They couldn't.
Well, the context was not helping them out.
Right.
There's no structure, there's little structure, little organization around helping these populations. And so people like Trump, this is not just Trump, it's in Brexit, it's all over the place in Italy. They will not just try to target them, they'll amplify the threats. And so I think what you see is that it's a logic that people are voting for him. They're not racists, I would argue. They're people who are really struggling, as you argue, with all the disruptions. And so the key is to understand that those groups really are tight for a good reason. It doesn't change overnight. We Americans we're greatly impatient. We think that we can go in and get the working class now to kind of get more creative and get more adaptable. I've talked to managers about this who try to do this, and they don't understand when you have a 3-year-old who's already being socialized to follow rules, that this doesn't change overnight. So we need to recognize the psychology of class, and then we need to also do what you have argued is happening in Lancaster and other places, which I think have kind of a Goldilocks principle, where there's a lot of openness, but there's some structure and there's some unity in these contexts.
So how do you make a tight culture loose? How do you make a loose or tight culture tight? How do you get to Goldilocks?
Yeah, this is a $1 million question. I think it's a great question, and I've been talking to a lot of managers about this, because you have tight organizations, manufacturing, that want to get more innovative. They hire innovative groups, R&D, and then they can't stand each other. And they don't anticipate these problems ahead of time. What happens with tight groups is they're used to having a lot of control, and so it's really threatening to introduce discretion. And the flip side, loose groups, when you try to tighten them up, I call it structured looseness, they tend to have fears over losing their autonomy. So you need good leaders, I call them ambidextrous leaders, who help these groups to deal with the fact that we're not going to have everything be now totally subject to discretion. But United's a great example. So in United, it was clearly a case that this place needs rules. We don't want these people doing all sorts of weird stuff, right? They're an airline. There's a lot of safety issues. But they started just following the rules blindly. They didn't think about, well, what domains in that context can we loosen up? Maybe we can give a little more flexibility to the customer service people on the ground. And so that's a way to sort of think about it. What domains can we give up some control in? The flip side in looseness also, it's like, okay, not everything has to be loose. I think Pixar is a good example of a place that on the surface looks really kind of loose, but they have a lot of structure, they have a lot of accountability. I'll talk about even just my own parenting style. These poor kids have been hearing about this for ages, because I think as parents, we can also think about what domains do we want to be tight in and what domains do we want to be loose in. Parents are pretty threatened people, right? We're just terrified what's going to happen to these kids. So the inclination is to tighten up in every domain. But we can sit down and negotiate it. We can actually make a list of here's all the domains. How you treat people, how you treat your siblings, your level of academic involvement, your sloppiness around the house. And we can say, wait, maybe we can give up some control in some of those contexts. We negotiated this. We had a formal negotiation, right? And Hannah's like, I don't remember this. But, I said to myself, and much to Todd's dismay, he veers tighter than me. I said, look, let them be slobs. That's okay, because I want them to treat each other nicely, and I want them to be tight in other domains. So what's interesting is that we just let this invisible force just kind of affect us, but we can negotiate it. And that's, I think, anything from politics to parenting or organizations, we can apply it to.
Todd, is Michelle tight or loose?
I think like everybody, she's tight in some domains, loose in others, but when it comes to being a slob,
Yeah, and I think I'm always late. My younger brother, who veers tighter, would attest to this. I mean, there are challenges, even on vacations, with your family. Like, I think we all could. I have a tight, loose mindset quiz on the website you can take, and I think it's helpful to understand each other, and then again, like, negotiate. Like, I'm never going to be up early on vacation, and we're going to be late, and we're going to switch plans a lot. But other domains can be tighter.
So you mentioned, that you began, shall we say, norms are omnipresent, they're invisible. Why are they so important, and like, where do they come from? Like, I come from a culture in Minnesota, very powerful norm, called Minnesota Nice. I just profiled Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I saw the emergence of leaders without authority. Very interesting phenomenon. Leaders without authority, who actually rescued the town. And it's surrounded by York, Reading, and Harrisburg that have no such leaders without authority. How can one town have this very unique norm, set of cultures, a set of norms and culture, producing leaders without authority who step up to rescue the community, and the other one just down the road can be so different?
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, we can see in our own communities big differences. And I think that norms more generally, we absolutely need them. We can't survive without them, right? If without them, they're so important to us that we couldn't survive. Societies would collapse, organizations would collapse, families would collapse. And I think that some communities like you're describing are being proactive about norms and the strength of norms. They're trying to say, let's recalibrate our social norms. We know this is going south. Other communities don't have those people who are coming together, who are getting out of their echo chambers, who are trying to say, let's put those identities aside and let's solve the problem. Let's create new norms and let's see it by trial and error, what's working, what's not working. And I think that those places they're deliberately organizing with new norms in ways that are so powerful. I think my own hometown of University Park, I have some neighbors out here, it's right here. I would say it's a great Goldilocks balance also in terms of norms. We have a lot of tolerance, but there's monitoring, there's accountability. And that happens because it's a pretty small community and people are observing behavior. They're calling people out, I'm driving too fast, it's on the listserv. But it's, I hope I didn't get called out just yet. But, it's a very amazing place. I would say there's University Park and Garrett Park are two places I would say are really like that, have that balance, where you feel a sense of identity, but also this tremendous amount of tolerance.
Which are the tightest countries in the world?
So I would say in our research, a lot of Middle Eastern cultures clearly have, for a variety of reasons, both because of actual threat, but also for leaders can create threat and ride the wave of tightness. Some tightness in the Middle East is caused by top-down forces, others bottom-up. And also East Asian cultures in general, not all, but some. I think all around the world, we're seeing tightening, is what I would say.
There's a trend right now.
I think that there's a trend in terms of Europe. We can see, we see that, the massive problem with cultural vacuums in Libya. We see that this produced something far worse than Gaddafi, right? Because we see this produced a tremendous amount of refugees and immigration that is now the source of incredible strife and conflict in Europe. And it's also the case, of course, that we have to have a balance on immigration, but also it's been exaggerated. Even Americans tend to overestimate the number of immigrants that are in this country. Germans by far overestimate how many immigrants are taking jobs. And it's time to calibrate on the threats. So part of it is that we're tightening for reasons that make sense, but part of it is that we are so caught up in our own echo chambers that we're getting so afraid that it's causing us to have tighter mindsets.
I also think you see this phenomenon where in places like Egypt or Jordan or even the West Bank, the Palestinians, their willingness to tolerate authoritarianism rises when you see the looseness of Syria or Libya.
Yeah.
That leads to chaos and disorder. People say, well, come there, but for the grace of God, go I. So I'll accept a little more tightness, in my context.
Yeah, you had a great phrase of they prefer 100 years of tyranny to 1 year of disorder. Right. And actually, this is, again, an amazing blind sight, cultural blind sight we have in our foreign policy. Because when it happened in Egypt, where Mubarak was taken out, it produced, at first, people saying, oh, we're finally free. But really, what was happening was becoming completely chaotic, completely normless. And in those contexts, we actually went out and did some surveys in Egypt at the time. And we could see that the people who felt this tremendous normlessness were the same people who wanted to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood or the Salafi government, because it's just intolerable. But what's amazing is that we sort of don't recognize these patterns. With ISIS, of course, everything is multiply determined. I don't want to say cultural psychology is the only explanation, but I could. But same thing, our data show that ISIS was originally welcomed in Mosul and other areas. And it was because there was so much disorder.
Taliban in Afghanistan.
So, I mean, we have to understand that, people yearn for security in these contexts when there's cultural vacuums. And it happens time and time again, but we just seem to miss it a lot.
Which are the loosest countries?
So on the flip side, we can go to the extreme looseness. A lot of the research we did showed that some of the former communist cultures that, again, were coming off of a lot of rules, going to the opposite end of the pendulum shift, which was like Ukraine. In our data, Venezuela, this was collected 15 years ago, the science data. Venezuela was extraordinarily loose. And we predicted there that there's going to be some kind of pendulum shift because it's untenable. Right. So, what we can see is that those very extreme ends of the continuum have problems, and that they typically have these kinds of rapid dynamical changes.
So if you couldn't live in America, but you could live in the Goldilocks country outside of America, which would it be?
Well, that's a great question. I can see my kids looking at me like, "Mom, say a fun place." There's a variety of places I would live for different reasons. I mean, I think clearly Israel is not a Goldilocks place, but it's a place where there's just tremendous creativity. I think that we can try to funnel that technological creativity into creativity for peace, perhaps. But it also veers loose. I like the culture of Singapore because it's so safe. And I threaten to them that we're going to go to Singapore if they misbehave as teenagers. It used to be that places like France had more of that Goldilocks, where it was balanced of openness, but also some degree of structure. I think, again, those contexts it's unclear how much they'll stay in that Goldilocks pattern.
I think I would have thought the London, without talking UK, was a perfect example of rule of law and then this sense of looseness, ultra-creative energy. And then kind of along came Brexit, and now you see that the UK, the ruling party there is so confused they can't even figure out how to fulfill their suicide note. Mm-hmm. So what happened there? How does tight loose explain what's going on there?
Yeah, it's actually I think it's an extremely similar pattern as our own working class problem. That it's an axis of it's no longer really national tight and loose. It's now looking at rural places that are struggling, working class that are threatened, that are voting for a traditional order that people are promising them. And that's happening all over the world. It's happening with Brexit. When you look at maps of who is voting to leave the European Union, it's the places where people are coming from working class that are being subject to severe disruptions that you talk about in your book. It's in Italy. I mean, these leaders are talking from almost like a tight loose textbook. They're announcing that their cultures are under severe threat, that Le Pen said that globalization is going to bring France down to their knees. And people who are threatened are really listening to that. So part of, there's no way out of this exactly, but part of it is trying to have more conversations around how threatened are we. I was really very proud to see that in Iowa, when that horrific murder happened that was done by an undocumented immigrant, that the parent of Molly Tippett actually called out Trump and said, this is not about immigration, because you could see that people were starting to get in their echo chambers. He said, this is about someone that was deeply disturbed. We wouldn't classify a neo-Nazi as being representative white people, just like we shouldn't be doing that with undocumented immigrants. So the more we have people who are challenging these perceptions, who are learning about each other face to face, like in Lancaster, or in my book, I talk about other examples where people come together who really don't like each other, but just sit together for some time just to talk it out. They may not agree on a lot, but they'll start to see each other as being far more similar than different.
Do you think as a country with a broad global foreign policy, we appreciate culture and the role of culture, or are there big lacunae there?
Yeah, I think that we're pretty ignorant about culture. I mean, we talk about intelligence or emotional intelligence, but we don't think about cultural intelligence. And there's scales that measure this. You know, we don't send people abroad, even top diplomats, who are culturally intelligent. We send people abroad because they're technically competent. And they often fail because they don't understand culture. Even people who speak another language doesn't mean they'll be culturally competent. And in some of the research we've done, we've actually measured different forms of intelligence to predict negotiation success in intercultural negotiations. And it was really CQ that predicts. And actually, I got interested in this topic because I was really concerned about the Baker and Aziz negotiations and what was happening with them. And in that case, this is like 1991 or, and I remember, you know, apparently Baker went in, was very low key, very unemotional, and said, "We will not invade." And you know, in Iraq, I mean in Kuwait, like these, you would be screaming. And this is just one dimension of cultural intelligence. Just understand your emotions and how they're interpreted by people in different cultures. Now, I'm not going to say that's the one event, cultural misunderstanding, that caused that problem, but it motivated me to say, I'm going to go and I'm going to get a PhD in cross-cultural psychology, and then I'm going to go work at the State Department and make sure these schmucks don't do this. Somehow along the way, I've got the academic bite, and I never did that. But I still think that that invisibility of culture, that we're young culture, we're impatient, and we're separated by oceans from people, makes us a little less attentive to culture than I think in Europe, for example.
You know, you mentioned Iowa, Michelle, my wife's from Iowa. Which are the loosest and tightest states?
So the South is very tight in our data. And they also have the most natural disasters. They also had the founder effect of the kind of people that settled in the South were coming from cultures where there were strong rules for honor, for example. So there's multiple top-down, bottom-up forces. There's also like Kansas and Indiana tend to veer tight.
I noticed Minnesota was in the middle.
Minnesota's right smack in the middle. And as I mentioned, you can kind of zoom into certain states. I mean, New York and also the coasts tend to be really loose. It's also part of our history, like the people who settled in New York, the diversity that was there, the people who went out and risked their lives to go out west, the diversity that was present in California, for example, in the 1850s. We've tracked it in the book. You'll see some data on this. It's remarkable. Now, not that there haven't been issues with tolerance in these places, but they were just from the beginning, they had that kind of loose spark that with the aid of not having a lot of disasters, I mean, California has its share of them, but the innovation of that place, it's just like Israel being a startup nation, California is kind of a startup state. And that kind of creativity and openness, diversity really helps it to maintain it.
Is Silicon Valley just all loose or not?
I think Silicon Valley is going through like a massive transformation in a very good way, in a very good second inning way that you call it. I really love that article because, you know, the internet is really, it's a profoundly important part of our lives. In fact, we live online now, right? So we spent years learning how to deal with each other face to face. We developed norms for accountability and for interaction, and we scaled up after the Industrial Revolution, and we managed that large-scale cooperation with norms, and now we have a normless environment that we live in all the time. And it's interesting, I was on a podcast with Kara Swisher last week, and she's like, they should have known this is going to happen. They should have anticipated the second inning. And she's like, don't you think they should have known? Shouldn't Zuckerberg be accountable for what he produced? And I said, you know, in psychology, we've known since the 80s that when you're interacting in email communication versus face-to-face, it produces terrible behavior. Things you would never do face-to-face, you'll do online. Or I wouldn't expect these guys to understand that. They're not psychologists. They're technical people. But now, in the second inning, they are more accountable. You know, we do want more monitoring. We do want our privacy to be directly affected by their policies. And we also, as humans, I think will rise to the occasion on the internet. We're seeing in places like in Reddit that people are starting to say, hey, we want open discussion, but we're not going to tolerate incivility. We're going to have badges. We're going to have people knocked out of these conversations. I think even kids manage to do this. You know, they know when people are starting to become uncivil online. So we need that bottom up. We need to start doing this ourselves, have more accountability, more monitoring while we have openness, but we need Silicon Valley to tighten up.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think you have to think about this a lot when you're at the New York Times because so I worked for a newspaper that was printed on dead trees, and um, and we had regulators on one side, very tight, and we had editors on the other, very tight. In the middle, we were expected to be kind of loose, but that regulator said if you want to take an ad out in the New York Times, you have to identify yourself, who you are. You can't take an
That's right.
anonymous ad out in the New York Times.
That's right.
And the editor said if you make a mistake in the New York Times, you have to correct it. And in the middle, on the dead
Interesting.
tree, we had readers and we had advertisers. And that was the source of our income. Then along came Facebook, and they said, we're not a newspaper, we're a platform. Okay? We're a platform. And by the way, we're cool. Okay? So we actually don't need any of your regulators, and we don't want any of your editors, but we want all of your readers and all of your advertisers. And we didn't know what to do. So they took all of our readers and all of our advertisers, and they told our regulators and our editors, just trust us. Trust us. And we trusted them, and they completely violated our
Yeah.
trust.
Yeah.
So I actually don't have much sympathy for them. I think Mark Zuckerberg's getting just what he deserves, and I hope they can tighten up. But there's a real tension
Yeah.
there because the reason they didn't want any regulators and editors was because they wanted to scale, and they wanted to scale because
That's
it
right.
was a winner-take-all market, and they would have more money. And so there's a real reckoning happening
Yeah.
now because they scaled faster than they could guarantee your privacy or the accuracy of their
Yeah.
system from people like Putin. And well, we're going through a real,
Yeah.
they're going through a real tight loose
Dilemma.
dilemma right
Yeah, that's right. I think that I totally agree. In the second inning, like we got to get these
now. I get this
people,
right.
yeah, they got to get this right. And I think that's where you see in them coming to Washington, this Washington Silicon Valley negotiation. We really were not prepared for this new online
Not at all.
looseness. And I think you talk about how we need more leadership from these people, and I agree with that. We talk about that they're not just businesses; they're reflecting our society. We've never had a moment like this. We've changed so fast; we're just barely catching up. And even places like Uber, we see that also. They were really just ruling the road, in no pun intended. And we didn't recognize, we didn't even have rules and that we could create as fast as they were rolling out. So this is our brand new world, is trying to negotiate norms as they change so dynamically, having the right balance of tight and loose in these online spaces. I think talking about it in these terms could help us to really have this shared mindset because it's just, I think people are just really struggling. The echo chambers that it produces also that we underestimated is another issue. So I think these are all like important, you know, disruptions that require norm organizing around norms.
So you studied negotiation, what different styles of negotiation, and one could make the argument that President Trump's negotiating style, we've seen in the last
Couple
few
days.
weeks, is actually quite effective. You ask for the moon, you bludgeon people.
Destroy your allies.
Canada, Mexico, but in the end, they came around. And same with the Supreme Court or anything else. Is there something to Trump's art of the deal, or is this an aberration?
Yeah, I mean, I teach negotiation, and I think he could use a class on it. You know, he uses a classic distributive negotiation style. It's something that we use in one-shot interactions. It's pretty effective when you don't have interdependence with people. If I go to the car salesmanship, either I'm going to take back $1,000 or they're going to take my $1,000. So I use hardball tactics. I don't care about that person. Trump is using that strategy ad nauseum with all of these negotiations. He gets rid of old deals rather than building on them. He doesn't use integrative types of strategies that are required in a global interdependent world. So they might work temporarily. He might, you know, win the battle, but not the war, because he's ruining a lot of alliances that are required for these kinds of complex negotiations. He might right now seem like he's successful because that's typical short-term way to think about it. But he also has no cultural intelligence. He constantly, in other cultures in the world, they're not as concerned at first about economics. They care about face, about honor. In the Middle East, where we study negotiation, it's honor over bread. Your reputation in a context where there's weak institutions is so important that you first are negotiating, does this person respect me? Are they gonna give me honor? And we have honor dictionaries that you can use in negotiations to show that people who are negotiating honor actually do far better long-term economically. And he's constantly violating people's honor publicly and face. And so he hasn't gotten that sort of cultural 101 lecture on this is downstream going to really harm your ability to forge agreements that are important. And so I would predict that it's going to backfire big time downstream.
Where does, you said tightness looseness comes from, because I might be living in a threat environment or whatever. But how long does it take to change? I mean, for instance, Dubai, very interesting case of a very strong rule of law,
Yeah.
that kind of tightness, but also then within that rule of law, a lot of freedom relative to its environment. Tunisia managed to navigate its way to a constitution that balanced tightness and looseness, particularly around women's rights and religious norms. Why does it happen there, and yet Egypt's spinning its wheels?
Yeah, it's a great question. Tunisia is the only place that today is ranked as partly or even free on the indications of freedom and Freedom House measures. What's interesting about Tunisia is that it had that sort of meso-level civic society. So autocrats thrive on getting people to distrust each other. That's their business. Because that's exactly. There is a book called Handbook of How to Become a Dictator that I have, and it's actually a serious book by political scientists. And it's all about how, you don't want people to be like forming alliances in an autocracy. So you do everything you can to get people to trust each other. So you have very small pockets of people that you trust. If you take out that autocrat, guess what? You don't have that general trust in the population. You can be organized enough to get rid of them, but not to form alliances to operate a society. Tunisia, I think, had more of those informal civic associations that were getting people connected across tribal lines. And Egypt actually forbade those things. It was extremely hard in Egypt to actually form civic associations. It was banned by the government. And nowadays, you can't even play sports in public settings in Egypt because they're worried about, I see my students going, I didn't see you. How are we doing? What time? Wait. Oh, we should take right. They're tight. I know it. So, I think it's extremely interesting that it's not surprising that most autocracies have this, what I call autocratic recidivism, where they go, when they're taken out, they go back to extremely loose. People don't trust each other, and they want another autocratic leader.
And spend so much energy making people mistrust.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because they need to do that. Now, in Tunisia, I have to look at some of the history, but it was very clear to me in analyzing that case that they had more of those meso-level institutions, we call them. By the way, I'll send you, we have a book on Arab Spring where we actually done some computer science type models where we actually can look at what happens when you take out a leader that doesn't have that meso-level structure. Do they end up going back to other autocratic leaders?
Is that what happened in Iraq?
Yeah, for sure. Because in Iraq, we have the same sort of pendulum shift. This is another example of American cultural ignorance on secularism and how those cultural vacuums will feed in even more, tighter forces, extremist forces. And so we talk quite a bit about that. I talk about that in the book also. So we'll have to have some more breakfasts and type frantically.
Before we go to questions, I'll tell you that I changed my business card last month. My business card used to say Thomas Friedman, New York Times foreign affairs columnist, and it now says Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times, humiliation, dignity, leadership, ownership, trust, and amplification correspondent.
You need some kind of acronym for that.
That's kind of what I've been doing for a living. I cover people acting out on their humiliation, questing for dignity. I've learned, what my teacher Dov Seidman says, trust is the only legal performance-enhancing drug. When there's ownership in the room, good things happen. And I've certainly learned a long time ago that, excuse me, in foreign policy, where I've come, which is that I'm not smart enough, even remotely, to figure out what's the right thing to do in Israel, the West Bank, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, or whatever. But I'm really into amplification these days, which is where I see something good, start it there, amplify it. I'd rather amplify Tunisia than
Yeah. Interesting.
Egypt in it, because they're doing it on their own, which means it's self-sustaining.
Yeah.
And I'm only looking now for things to amplify.
Yeah.
You know.
Sounds like your next book.
Well, I don't know.
I actually want to nominate Tom Friedman for president.
No,
He has a Mother Nature platform, right? So you have a running mate.
I get my playing golf, but floor is open.
Yeah, floor's open, and we have some food also. So let's just open it for questions though for now, and then yes. Hmm. Yeah, wow, that's fantastic. I guess I'll start with the first question, maybe, and then have you chime in on the second too. I think for sure there's a connection between the unwritten rules that we have and the written rules we have. Sometimes we have leaders, though, that really make profound changes first to the written that will then affect the unwritten. Singapore is a good example. Lee Kuan Yew was a really good cross-cultural psychologist. He said, guys, we have a lot of people per square mile, 20,000 people per square mile. We have a lot of different ethnic groups. We need strong formal rules to help deal with this, and that also trickled down to the informal behavior. But you have other contexts where it's the reverse, where it's more bottom up, and then this affects laws. So I think there's different paths to those written and unwritten rules, but they definitely correlate. On the second question, I think that, again, we misunderstand that the internet, it's not making people sort of communicate with people that are similar to them. If anything, we're finding that people stick with people within their own tribe. There's studies of people around the world. We expected maybe people would use the internet to connect with people around the world. Just not the case. People are when you look at maps, actually, of who's communicating with whom, it's really, really local. So I think that the internet could exacerbate some of the biases that we have. So I'm not sure I'd recommend that approach. That's just my sense. Any? Yeah. Yeah, part of the issue here also, and then we'll just open it up, is that we have a problem with people believing what other people are saying. So you might say, here, this is what everyone says, but people might not even believe that anymore. So this is the trust issue that I think you talked about. So I think there's a lot of steps to be taken for that in the ideal world to work. Yeah. It is remarkable irony that the people that are attracted to Trump are the very people who would tolerate these kinds of anti-normative behavior. My prediction is that won't last it won't last indefinitely. And that's because the very policies that at least in the context of the U.S., my read on them is they're going to hurt these people badly. And so when that wake-up call happens, then we'll see less of this mutual bargain that you're talking about.
So just to pick up on that, Trump famously boasted, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and my supporters would still be with me. How do you get there as a leader? Why does one leader? Because you see actually that phenomenon around the world. I think it's true in some sense. The relationship between Netanyahu and his followers. I'm not saying murder somebody, but he has that same kind of bond. Erdogan and his followers, where they're almost just completely Teflon.
Yeah.
There's nothing they can do. Is that because those people actually hate the people who hate their leader more than they care about their leader?
I think that's right. I think what's happening is that there's a tremendous conformity in his party where they're worried about speaking out against him. It's almost like once we have some people, you talked about how can we change these things. Once we have a critical mass of people who start to call him out on the behavior, then people have less tolerance for it. The problem is that those people are so worried about getting reelected. They're so worried about him calling them out. I was really admired your point when we talked at breakfast one day. You said, I insult Trump all the time. I don't care what he ever does to me. I'm not worried about him. Unfortunately, the people that in his party don't feel the same way. And so if we have some people who start to do it, unfortunately, they tend to be people who are retiring, right? Who don't have to worry about this. But, they're worried about getting humiliated by him, let alone their $175,000 job. So that's why I think that he can get away with this, because he's not accountable, because people are conforming and worried about him really punishing them.
Well, I suggest we continue this conversation outside. I think
Yeah. And also, thank you so much for coming. It was fabulous to have you. We'll be out there, eating some food.